Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Garment Maker's Daughter by Hilary Adrienne Stern. Narrated by Gabra Zackman. There is nothing I would not do for those who are really my friends. I have no notion of loving people by halves. It is not my nature. Jane Austen, Northanger Abbey. Part 1. Chapter 1. September 1917. Daniel Cowan knew well what it was like to be surrounded by people and still feel lonely. But it wasn't loneliness he felt as he wended his way through the crowds on the deck of the SS Pretoria. Instead, he perceived his solitariness as conferring a kind of freedom. For once, he had an opportunity to be who and what he chose, unlimited by anyone's prior knowledge. On this ship, no one knew about his past, nor did they care. They were concerned only with their own uncertain but hopeful futures. He was headed for the ship's bow, hoping to catch his first glimpse of land, although rumor had it that they wouldn't reach Ellis Island and the port of New York until the next day. 22 years old and gangly, with wheat-colored hair, guileless blue eyes, and gold-rimmed glasses, he stood at least a head taller than most of those around him. Even stooping a little, as was his habit, he had an excellent view of his surroundings. The deck was more crowded than he'd seen it in the 2 weeks they'd been at sea. The reemergence of the sun, after 3 days of heavy wind and rain, no doubt had something to do with that. To his right, people lined the rails that ran along the sides of the ship from stem to stern. To his left, the upper-class decks rose like tears on a wedding cake. Everywhere in between was filled with the tops of people's heads, making the deck appear as impenetrable as a tree-covered mountain. Any movement from one part of the ship to another would require determination and patience. Daniel had both. He forged a serpentine path, detouring around clamorous families who had staked out pieces of deck as if they were the front parlors of the homes they'd left behind. Darting children cut in front of him, forcing him to pull up short to avoid tripping over them. But he didn't mind. With every delay, his anticipation grew. There was a current of excitement in the air, and he felt it charging through him. The sound of a crying child caught his attention. It came from a little boy planted like a small, stubby rock in the midst of streaming people. Daniel had never been able to pass by any creature in need, and he was tempted to help. But even before he had taken a step in the toddler's direction, a young man about his own age came along and scooped the child up in a big hug. Relieved, he resumed walking. By now he had come within 50 feet of the bow. It was even more crowded here, with people jockeying for a spot that would afford an unhampered view. Searching for a way to get closer to the rail, his attention was arrested by the sight of a young woman perched on a box, as still as a statue. She was immersed in a book, and clearly oblivious to the people around her as she rapidly scanned one page after another. Seeing her so completely absorbed, Daniel realized how he must often have looked to others, there, but not there. His mind, his self, transported to a place and time created entirely by words on a page. He tried to make out the title of the book, but a young girl who stationed herself directly in front of the reader with her hands on her hips suddenly blocked his line of sight. "Lena!" the girl said loudly. There was no reaction. "Lena!" she said again, louder. Still no response. The girl cupped her hands around her mouth, took a deep breath, leaned in, and yelled, "Lena!" Watching, Daniel could see it all play out on the young woman's face, the abrupt collision of the real world with the one in her head, and her obvious irritation when she realized who had interrupted her. "What is it?" she said warily. "Are you deaf? I've been saying your name over and over." "I didn't hear you." "You mean you pretended not to hear me so you could keep reading?" the young girl said. "What is it?" Lena said with practiced patience. "You have to come back with me. We'll be arriving in New York any minute, and we have to get our things ready.
Don't you even care that we're almost there? Don't you care about anything besides that book?"
At the mention of the book, Lena's annoyance seeped away, and her gaze softened. Daniel knew that she was back again in the world in which she'd been lost only a few moments before. Her mouth curved to reveal a generous smile. It transformed her face, softening her angular cheekbones, punctuating her pointed chin with a dimple, and bringing balance to her wide-set eyes.
"It's a wonderful story," she said, her voice passionate, her face animated. "You must read it. It's about a woman named Huddle who falls in love with a man named Perchik. He's a revolutionary fighting to overthrow the Tsar, and Huddle wants to fight alongside him, so they decide to get married, and—" "What kind of crazy story is that?" the younger girl interrupted. "A woman fighting? And the two of them deciding to get married without the help of a matchmaker? The whole thing sounds stupid."
Daniel watched Lena struggle with the urge to make some retort, her face an easy read, but she reconsidered, and instead smiled.
"You're still young," she said. "You'll feel differently when you're older." "Well, maybe I am younger than you," the girl said, thrusting her chin forward, "but at least I'm not a dreamer."
As Lena's smile vanished, Daniel recoiled inwardly at the barbed words. Variations of those same words had been hurled at him many times. He wanted to tell the rude young girl that reading was a gift, that books were to be treasured, and that there was nothing wrong with being a dreamer. While he debated whether to thrust himself into the conversation, Lena responded.
"Yes, I know. You're not a dreamer.
In fact," she said with the barest hint of a smile,
"I can barely imagine you ever having any dreams at all."
Daniel had to stifle himself to avoid laughing out loud at the way Lena had turned the girl's insult back on her without the youngster even realizing it. But at that moment, his presence was detected.
"What are you looking at?"
the young girl demanded. Heat flooded his face, and he knew he was turning red as he always did when he was flustered. He opened his mouth to apologize for staring, but no words came to mind. So he looked down, and his glasses slipped down his nose. Hurriedly he adjusted them. By the time he raised his head, they were no longer paying him any attention.
"Come on,"
the younger girl said.
"All right, I'm coming."
He watched them as they wove their way into the crowd, a mixture of emotions swirling inside him. Chief among these was regret that he'd not spoken up in defense of Lena. Here he was dreaming of taking on a new identity, but still allowing his old one to determine his actions. He would not let it happen again. He resumed his journey toward the bow, and almost at once, off in the distance, he saw another female. Someone he'd been dreaming about ever since he'd conceived of this journey. She was just as beautiful as he'd imagined. As the ship steamed forward, her outlines became clearer, the draped garb, the raised torch, the crown on her head. A grin monopolized his face, and he found himself wanting to share the moment with someone. Around him, fathers were hoisting children onto their shoulders so they could see the fabled statue. Next to him, two sisters stood, their arms around each other's waists, their faces rapturous. On his other side, an elderly couple trembled shoulder to shoulder, whether in fear of the unknown future or in delight, it was hard to tell. A hand clasped his shoulder, and he turned to see a gleaming smile creasing a worn, olive-skinned face and twinkling dark eyes. It was Martelli, the dapper little Italian man who slept in the bunk directly opposite his.
"Bella, no?"
Martelli asked. He gestured toward the statue.
"Signora Liberty è bellissima, no?"
Daniel grinned.
"Yes, very bella," he said.
He looked back at the Statue of Liberty. He had been dreaming of this moment for so long. Now he just had to pass the immigration inspection and be admitted into the United States. Everyone knew that America was the land of new beginnings, and no one needed a new beginning more than he did. Chapter 2. The wiry fuzz of a wool blanket against her chin tickled Lena awake, and she rolled over onto her side, luxuriating in the roominess of a real bed all to herself after weeks of sleeping in a narrow bunk. In the silent darkness of Yosef's boarding-house room, it was hard to tell what time it was, but she was too keyed up to fall back asleep. She didn't want to disturb her brother, so she distracted herself with a daydream of the type she indulged in far too often. She would get a job, of course, but she would also go to school. She imagined taking classes in all kinds of subjects, everything from botany to philosophy to literature. In her fantasy, she found one particular subject that enthralled her and began studying it in depth. There was a handsome and brilliant student in the same department who shared her passion, and they began doing research together. One day they made an amazing, world-changing discovery. They were jointly nominated for the Nobel Prize. They would... The sound of Yosef stirring brought her back to the present. Her eyes had adjusted enough for her to make out his bear-like form in the wing chair he'd insisted would be fine for the night. Guilt flooded her. As soon as she'd seen that his room had only one bed, she'd tried to talk him into allowing her to sleep on the chair. But he had shaken his head and said she needed to get some rest, after all she had been through. She knew that this comment, along with the crushing hug he'd given her at Ellis Island, was his way of acknowledging how difficult the last few months had been for her as their father's sole caretaker until he succumbed to tuberculosis. She knew, too, that Yosef's reluctance to say more was not because he was unemotional, but rather because he didn't trust himself not to be overly emotional. There had been times growing up when Yosef, 6 years her elder, had been the only one around to watch over her. Their mother had died during an outbreak of influenza when Lena was 3 years old. Their father had put in long days at his tailoring shop in Lublin. The grandmothers and aunts who might have helped were back in the tiny shtetl where their parents had grown up. Without family nearby, the burden of caring for Lena had fallen mostly on Yosef, and he'd generally been good about it. Of course, growing up, they'd had their moments. Once he'd made something for dinner that had been completely inedible and insisted that she eat it anyway. When she'd complained, he'd yelled, and she'd started to cry. Even then, she'd known he wasn't really upset with her, just with himself. As if a young boy should be expected to know how to cook. And there had been other times, too, when he hadn't been as gentle as he might have been, but she'd always seen the love behind whatever front he put on, and they'd always been close. Yosef was still sleeping, but she couldn't lie still any longer. She pulled her valise from beneath the bed and removed her black skirt and white blouse. After dressing, she bent again to close the suitcase, but paused to retrieve one last but very important article, a soft white handkerchief. She held it tightly and brought it up to her face to breathe the lingering scent of her mother's perfume, a woody and floral fragrance with just a hint of lemon. Because she'd been so young when her mother died, most of what she thought she remembered about her were actually things that had been told to her. How thrilled her mother had been to have a daughter, how she had danced with Lena in her arms, and how she had entertained her with stories while she hung the wash on the line. She did have a few memories that were really her own, but these were elusive and insubstantial, like the yeasty smell of the bread that her mother had baked every Friday in preparation for Shabbat, and the muffled sounds of her mother going about her housework while she drifted into her afternoon nap. Her only clear recollection had to do with the handkerchief. As a small child, she'd gone around with what seemed to be a perpetual cold. It hadn't been anything serious, probably just an allergy, but whenever her nose got too frustratingly stuffy or messily runny, there was her mother at the ready, pulling her handkerchief out of the pocket of her apron, kneeling so that her face was level with Lena's, cupping her chin with one hand, and gently wiping her nose with the soft cloth. The handkerchief worked like magic. No matter how dirty it became, no matter how many times it was laundered, it still came out pure and clean. Time and again it blossomed in her mother's hand like a soft white lily to clean her messy face, wipe away sloppy tears, or press gently against her knee when she scraped it. The fabric was both strong and soft at the same time, and without fail, it made everything better. The handkerchief was the only object she could really remember her mother holding and touching her with, and it was easily the most precious thing she owned. An hour later she hurried to keep up with Yosef as they departed for the factory where he worked. A bleak dawn was beginning to permeate the sky, but the light had not yet penetrated to street level. Boarding houses and apartments were jammed tightly against each other on either side of the street. Their fronts were darkly forbidding, with facades barred by metal fire escapes from which laundry fluttered like flags of surrender. At the first corner they turned left onto a much wider and longer street. Here, horse-drawn carts hugged the curb. Merchants pulled away tarps to reveal fruit and vegetables, spices and grains. As they continued to walk, dawn arrived, and along with it came customers in great multitudes. The street filled with a cacophony of sounds as vendors hawked, livestock squawked, children whooped, mothers yelled, horses snorted, and still more carts rumbled down the already clogged street. Lena pulled up her skirt's hem to protect it from the horse droppings as she listened to Yosef's description of his workplace, so she would know what to expect. According to her brother, the Northern Shirtwaist Company was owned by Jack Gordon, an immigrant from Russia who'd started out working for someone else but quickly branched into business for himself. Gordon had built his business by being tough, thin-skinned, and stingy. He trusted no one, including his own family members, who he hired to help him run the business because he trusted outsiders even less. "You don't really have to worry about Gordon," Yosef said as they crossed the street toward a white brick building on the corner. "He mostly stays in his office on the 10th floor. It's his brother-in-law, Max Horowitz, you have to watch out for. He's in charge of the sewing floor, and he's a real ganef. But if he likes you, he'll leave you alone." They followed a group of young women into the building and joined the back of a crowd waiting for the elevator. Hearing the muffled sound of the car landing, Lena prepared to move forward. But when the operator pulled the inner and then outer grates open, the interior was large enough to accommodate only perhaps 20 people. It was not until the lift had made 2 full trips that she and Yosef were able to board. Penned in on all sides, Lena's heart thrummed anxiously as they ascended creakily to the 7th floor, where Yosef had started before moving up to the higher-paying cutting room on the 8th floor. The elevator opened onto a narrow hallway, and she and Yosef moved along with the others like herded sheep. At the end of the hall, the doorway to the sewing room was blocked by a man whose shoulders were broader than the frame. Max Horowitz was bald, with bulging, lidless eyes and a thick neck. Even without Yosef's warning, Lena would have known he was someone to be wary of. Just before they reached him, Yosef quickly whispered in her ear, "Lena, just for today, let me do all the talking. Don't say a word no matter what. And one more thing, I forgot to tell you. In America, I go by the name Joe." "What?" Lena said. "Shh." Max Horowitz was affectless as Yosef inquired as to whether there were any job openings. The only sign that he'd heard anything was the slow shifting of his stare from Joe to Lena. Under his scrutiny, she felt the weight of the power he wielded. After a minute, his eyes shifted back to Joe. "Wie alt is sie?" "How old is she?" Horowitz asked. 17. 17, Joe answered. "Is das ihre erste Arbeit in Amerika?" "Is this her first job in America?" "Jo." "Yes." "Does she know how to work the machine?" Yosef nodded. "Our father was a tailor, and she operated his machine many times." He put a hand on Lena's shoulder and added, "She's a quick learner." Horowitz shifted his eyes back to Lena, but said nothing. As the silence and the scrutiny continued, she felt a strong urge to say something. Her father had always encouraged her to speak her mind. "Listen to me, Lena," he would say. "Women are just as smart as men. Didn't Eve eat from the tree of knowledge even before Adam? Don't let anyone treat you like you haven't got a good head on your shoulders. Just because a woman must occasionally wield a dish rag doesn't mean she has to be one." Now, seeing the expression on Horowitz's face, Lena thought she could tell him a thing or two about how people back home praised her precise stitchery, and how sometimes, when Papa's old machines broke down, she was able to tinker with them and get them to work again. But remembering Yosef's cautionary words, she held her tongue. She slipped her hand into her pocket, curled her fingers around the handkerchief, and concentrated on keeping her emotions from showing. Abruptly, Horowitz nodded. "All right. I'll try her out." He looked back at Joseph again and spoke rapidly. $5 a week to start. If she breaks a sewing needle, I deduct 10 cents, and for every shirtwaist she ruins, I deduct 25 cents. She messes up too much, she's out of a job." Joseph nodded, and Horowitz stepped aside, leaving room for Lena to enter. She gave her brother a quick last glance, received an encouraging smile, and took her first steps into the sewing room. Her breath caught in her throat at the sight before her. The room was filled with row after row of sewing machine top tables wedged against each other, perhaps 300 in all. The rows spanned nearly the entire width of the room. At the far end they butted up against large, filmy windows that admitted dim light. A narrow aisle on the near end afforded the only means of access. Above the tables were thick black electric cords strung like clotheslines from one end of the room to the other. Dangling tentacle-like wires connected the lines to the sewing machines below. It was a far cry from the cozy tailor shop where Lena's father had plied his trade. Horowitz pointed to an empty chair in the third row. "Sit there," he said. "Sophie will show you what to do." Taking her seat, Lena examined the black iron sewing machine. With relief, she saw that it was not terribly different from the one her father had used. By now the room was filling up, with some men, but mostly women and a few girls, some no more than 11 or 12 years old. The workers filed along the narrow aisle and squeezed down the rows, chatting and laughing up until the moment they took their seats. As the aisle began to empty, the noise of machine wheels whirring and bobbins clacking up and down took over the room, and Lena began to feel foolish sitting idle in the midst of so much industriousness. Waiting for Sophie to arrive, Lena snuck a glance around her. A group of very young children sitting in a circle of chairs at the front of the room puzzled her, until she saw one little girl reach down and pick up some fabric. The child held it in the air, studying it. Then, with a pair of tiny scissors, she began to snip at the threads that dangled unfinished from the material. It dawned on Lena sadly that these little ones were Northern's youngest workers. A woman squeezed behind her and slipped into the seat to her left. Lena tried to catch her eye and was rewarded with a quick, shy smile.
"Sophie?"
she ventured. The woman shook her head, bent over her machine, and began to oil it with a small, spouted can. Thinking it couldn't hurt for her to do the same, Lena reached for the oil can nearest her. Suddenly, she felt a jolt against her chair.
"Steh auf!"
Stand up. The angry Yiddish caught her by surprise, and she twisted around to see a stout girl with wiry brown hair. She stared down at Lena with flaring nostrils and brows that joined each other across the bridge of her nose.
"Steh auf," the girl repeated. "Das ist mein Stuhl."
"This is my chair." Lena glanced around. Horowitz was several rows away, working on another girl's machine. If he'd heard anything, he gave no sign of it. Maybe that was for the best. She twisted around in her seat again and tamped down the temptation to answer in the same tone she'd been addressed.
"Are you Sophie? Because Herr Horowitz said—"
"I'm not Sophie, and I don't care what Max said. All I care about is the fact that you're sitting in my chair. Get out." Lena felt sure she was sitting in the seat she'd been assigned.
"Maybe we should ask Mr. Horowitz what we should do," she suggested.
"What?" the girl shouted at her over the din of the machines. "I said maybe we should ask Mr. Horowitz," Lena shouted back. "Oh, so now you're telling me what to do?"
"No,
Lena stopped mid-sentence and thought furiously. Obviously she couldn't disobey Horowitz. She'd never had any trouble standing her ground, but getting into a fight on her first day also didn't seem prudent. Maybe if she tried again to explain. She started to rise, but a slight pressure on her arm made her pause. Her neighbor on the right had arrived.
"Halt sich ein,"
the new girl said softly. She smiled at Lena, displaying dazzling white teeth against bright red lip color.
"If Horowitz told you to sit there, you should stay there."
She turned her attention to the wire-haired girl. She was still smiling, but there was no longer any warmth behind it, and her eyes now gleamed with something less than amiable.
"You will have to find another seat, Anna," she said.
Anna's scowl deepened.
"Stay out of it, Sophie. It's none of your business. Now,"
she glared again at Lena,
"for the last time, get out of my seat."
Lena glanced back at Horowitz. He was still preoccupied with the malfunctioning machine. She turned back to Anna and shook her head slowly. Beside her, Sophie was through being pleasant.
"Let go of the chair, Anna," she directed, "and leave the new girl alone. You've been late to work every day for a week, and now it's going to cost you your seat."
"It's none of your business," Anna repeated. "Stay out of it."
"But it is my business," Lena said, "and I don't want her to stay out of it."
She glanced at Sophie, saw confirmation in her eyes, and looked back at Anna. Suddenly, with surprising stealth for such a large man, Horowitz loomed over them all. "What's going on here?" he said.
"She's sitting in my seat,"
Anna hissed, giving the back of Lena's chair a little tug. Lena kept her tone neutral.
"I'm just sitting where you told me to sit."
Horowitz looked from Lena to Anna and back again. Finally, he turned to Sophie. "You say what happened." Sophie shrugged and met Horowitz's stare with a cool gaze.
"The new girl didn't do nothing wrong," she said.
"All right, then," Horowitz said. "You," he pointed at Anna. "Sit over there." He indicated an empty seat at the end of the row against the window wall. "Sophie, you show the new girl what to do."
"But that's not fair," Anna said. "It'll take me 10 minutes just to get in and out of that seat. I've been working here for 5 months already. I earned this seat."
Horowitz shrugged. "It's that seat or no seat," he said. Then he turned and walked away.
"Schmuck,"
muttered Anna. She gave Lena's chair another shove.
"You'll pay for this. And you too, Friedman,"
she added, shooting Sophie a venomous look. She squeezed down the row, bumping into the back of every seat she passed. Watching Anna's retreating back, Lena murmured,
"Wonderful. My first day, and already I've made an enemy."
"Well," Sophie said breezily, "one enemy and one friend, so you're even. Anyway, don't worry. Anna's a nasty bitch who's been getting on my nerves for a long time. She deserves what she got." Lena stared at her new co-worker, unsure which was more shocking, Sophie's language or the way she looked. With her jet-black hair piled on her head and her obviously rouged lips and cheeks, there was a vivacity to her that made her stand out in the crowded room like a peacock in a coop full of chickens. Clearly, this was someone she needed to know better. Taking in the expression on Lena's face, Sophie's shoulders shook as she laughed, her smile assuring Lena that she was not laughing at her, but rather inviting Lena to laugh with her. Which Lena did, until a severe glance from Horowitz silenced them both.
"We'd better get to work,"
Sophie said. She reached into a basket on the floor beside her chair, pulled up a bundle of white cotton material loosely tied with a string, untied it, and demonstrated how the various pieces of fabric needed to be joined together to produce a single shirtwaist.
"What do we do with them when we're done?" Lena asked. "Put them in that basket on the table, behind your machine. Tony Marullo comes by once an hour to pick up the finished goods and bring more material. But keep track of your own count," she warned. "They're always trying to cheat us."
Lena reached for a bundle from the basket at her feet and got started. Within a short time she had mastered the process and deposited her first shirtwaist in the basket behind her machine. Then she reached down and grabbed another bundle. Even before her basket of finished shirtwaists was full, a door at the front of the room burst open, and a tall, olive-skinned boy, his arms loaded with fresh bundles of fabric, skittered in. Then Tony Marullo quickly began weaving his way down each row, passing out new material. When he reached the back of the room, he reversed himself, and, holding one long arm out like a rod, gathered finished shirtwaists with the other, slinging them over the waiting limb. Hours passed. Sharp-edged pangs bounced against Lena's empty stomach. The constant up-and-down motion of the sewing needle, like a vertical pendulum, became mesmerizing. Tony Marullo's periodic crashing entrance was the only relief from the endless sameness of the morning. After a while, she barely even noticed Tony as he came around with new supplies of material. Finally, a shrieking whistle sounded, followed immediately by the scraping of chair legs. Lena stood up slowly, her back stiff and her neck tight. Edging out of the aisle, she...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?